All of these processes that I'm about to describe are self-promoting. Once things start to go downhill, your body basically has a precipitous momentum drop into hibernation type metabolism and fat gain. Once your body gets that signal, it's going to start going all out, and it's going to try to everything in its power to get you and maintain you into that state until you pull it out. So it's really not as simple as just cutting the calories. You need to address these issues. Hello everyone, this is Dalton of Analyze and Optimize, and welcome back to Metabolic Mastery. Today I'm going to be discussing the issues of obesity and weight loss. And if you're new to the channel, this is not going to be your average everyday, oh, we just got to cut calories and here's like one way to do it. No, it's going to be nothing like that. We're talking about the issues of obesity and weight gain, the processes that govern these biological functions on a biological level that makes sense in the real world. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what the conventional sort of wisdom is and explain why I think it's very misguided, even if some parts of it may be true. So I think that probably the biggest problem in all of this is that the main sort of piece of conventional wisdom is that it's all about discipline, right? Oh, you just need to eat less, right? But I see one huge problem with that, which is that I know plenty of people who are extremely disciplined who can't seem to lose weight. And then I also know plenty of people who are incredibly undisciplined and seem to be able to eat whatever they want and, don't gain substantial amounts of weight. And I'm sure you can attest to that. But I think that this narrative kind of emerges from individuals who may be a part of the fitness industry, so to speak, people that are paid to get other people in shape, weight loss coaches, if you will. And I think it's especially bad in the age of social media, especially with things like TikToks and Instagram Reels, where everything's about flash and, really just ego, and people can become celebrities overnight. I think it's a lot about people wanting to say, hey, I did this, look at me. If you can't do it, then you're not as good as me. So, worship me, basically. And I think that this is extremely not only wrong on a scientific sort of mechanistic level, but it's also incredibly damaging to the people who watch this because they're thinking, oh my God, is it really just me? Am I just a flawed individual? No, of course you're not. You are probably just put into a bad situation. And honestly, nowadays, I think most people, if not everybody, is born into a bad situation given how bad the environment is. It kind of almost reminds me of the trends that I see. I watch a lot of basketball, and it kind of reminds me of the trends that I see in the NBA where, you have old players coming out and saying, these new guys, they don't care about the game as much. They care about getting paid. They care about the flash. They care about being a celebrity. They don't care. It's not about the love of the game of basketball like it used to be with the new stars. And honestly, I think it's very similar to that in the field of sort of fitness and fat loss in general. I think people are more concerned with upholding this image and basically stroking their own ego rather than actually trying to help people, because they don't realize that in saying the things that you are saying, you are actively discouraging people who may not look at things the same way that you do. It's also kind of under the same guise as, when people say, oh, you're not depressed, you just don't have a purpose, or you just need to suck it up, or whatever. And none of that stuff is actually helpful, because if you've ever been depressed, or if you ever have met someone who struggles a lot with depression, it's not as simple as just sucking it up. Obviously, it's not as simple as just giving someone a pill. We talked way too much about that in the past, but the point still applies. And then finally, the other thing is that having an appetite in and of itself is actually a very good thing. It's a sign of health. It's a sign of youth. I mean, you think about children, they are literally eating all of the time and they don't blow up in weight. Well, nowadays, some of them do. But normally, children are very lean and they eat a lot, but their metabolic rates are extremely high. They're always burning the energy off and they're always curious about the world. They're always thinking about things, right? And if you want to think about what it is like to lose your appetite, imagine being sick. God forbid, you can imagine someone having cancer. These people, they definitely have lost weight, unfortunately, but they are clearly not in good body composition and they're obviously not in good health, but they just have zero appetite and they're just wasting away. And ironically, a lot of the weight loss advice that is given actually puts you in the state, the metabolic state, that is actually very similar to that of cancer. Some other narratives blame specific macronutrients. So they'll say either it's the carbs or it's the fat, or most of all, it's the sugar, right? Well, we have multiple examples of cultures, different societies throughout history who eat all sorts of different macronutrient compositions. We have populations who eat basically pure starch diets. We have populations who eat basically pure fat diets with a little bit of protein. And then we can also just look back in US history to not even 100 years ago when people were eating massive quantities of sugar, fat, yet the body composition that is associated with the I guess would be 70s or 80s era, people had much better body compositions on average than they do now, yet they were eating all those kinds of stuff, even lots of sugar and lots of fat at the same time. You can look at the French diet. It's considered the French paradox that they're so healthy, yet they're eating all of these carbs and sugars and pastries and saturated fats and drinking all this wine, but they're extremely healthy. So how do you explain that? The other thing is that, contrary to popular belief, you don't want to just crush your sugar cravings. It's actually a known sign of something called anhedonia, which is basically the lack of ability to feel pleasure. That is a very common sign in aging, disease, and especially in mental health disorders. People stop feeling pleasure from life, and sugar is one of the most primary hedonic experiences that you can have is eating sugar. Another common narrative is that it's all about ultra processed foods, and because the foods are so hyper palatable now, that people are just gorging on more food. Well, first of all, people aren't eating more food now than they did even 100 years ago or so. People actually ate more back then, yet they were much leaner. So there's a giant flaw in the logic there. But also because, me personally, I have been losing weight over the last 3 months or so, and I'll do a whole video on that once I'm done, I guess, leaning out. But my diet is literally steaks, it's lamb, it's fresh shrimp, scallops, I eat ice cream, I make French fries, I do milkshakes, honey, chocolate. Does this sound like a boring diet or a diet that's not very palatable? It's definitely not to me. I love the food that I eat, yet I still am just dropping weight and barely even thinking about it. That is the ideal outcome, to eat not whatever you want, because obviously there are not good foods and we'll get into that, but to eat basically intuitively and still be at a good body composition, not having to starve yourself or actively think about restricting yourself. That should be the optimal outcome. I also don't like this because, again, it turns people off from actually trying to lose weight. They're saying, well, if I just have to eat chicken and boiled rice and broccoli, steamed broccoli all the time, then I would rather just be fat because I like food and everybody likes food. No one wants to eat a bland, boring diet like that. So people will just give up and say, well, whatever, I'd rather eat the good food and just die early or just look worse. And honestly, I can understand that. The other ironic thing is that we have plenty of animal evidence. And by plenty of animal evidence, I mean that the literal diets that are used for animals to breed them and make sure that they are healthy are all pure, refined, by definition, processed diets. So clearly, if you can reliably give that to millions of animals, knowing that it does not make them fat, not make them obese, and in fact, you use that as the control so that when you do make an animal fat, you can compare it to something, that is a highly processed and refined diet. So again, clearly it has nothing to do with the processing of the food. And then there's also the fact that no one really actually knows what food processing means. If I take an onion and I start chopping it up, that's technically processing it. You're going to say, oh, well, it's not packaged or whatever the case may be. But I can tell you from experience, and there's plenty of research on it, most notably Walter Kempner's rice diet. That was a pure refined carbohydrate diet, and these people were easily dropping weight and reversing their hypertension. So again, it has nothing to do with the processing or the refining of foods. It has to be something else. Then there's this other narrative that, of course, it's all about calories, right? It's all about calories. It's just like a budget. It just adds up over time. 100 calories there, 100 calories there. You look at a peanut butter cup, that's 100 calories. And then, over the course of 50 or 60 years, it just adds up over time. You're just not managing your budget properly. No, this is a ridiculous idea in my view. I mean, can you imagine if this is how it actually worked, that you would have to literally eat the same amount of food every single day in order to maintain your weight? I mean, this is an absurd idea. And again, we have plenty of evidence showing that not only did people used to eat more and they were leaner, and other societies, the same is true, but we also literally have studies where if you force feed people, they may gain weight transiently, but then they immediately lose it once you let them eat by their intuition. And conversely, the opposite is true. If you forcefully restrict people, they'll go right back up to the same weight if they're basically at biological equilibrium. And in many cases, you can just overfeed these people and they'll just burn it all off, because the body is smart. The body is not a checkbook. It's not a budget. It knows exactly where it wants to be at, and it's going to use the resources that are available to maintain whatever equilibrium it wants to be at. So then the question becomes, how do I get to an equilibrium of a low body weight? Not how can I restrict my food so that my body is at a given body weight, or it wants to be at a given body weight, but I'm forcing it to be at this other body weight because some guy on TikTok was yelling at me. Then finally, there's just the narrative of genetics. It just runs in the family. It's all about genes. I feel like I don't even need to address this. Everyone knows that this is not true, right? I mean, you're not just born into being fat. At least when you came out as a baby, you might have had a little baby fat, but you weren't fat. You weren't obese, right? So clearly, it has nothing to do about genetics. I don't even need to talk about science for this one. It's just common sense. Like, obviously, people lose weight and they fluctuate in weight all the time. It's not predetermined. So, I mean, look, at the end of the day, do I like the whole pro-fat movement or fat acceptance or healthy at any size movements that, the media seems to be promoting, or that individuals on social media may be partaking in? No, I'm not a fan of that. I do think that there is some truth to the idea that you can be healthy at any size, but not in the way that it's being advertised to us, that you can just literally gorge on as much food as possible and just not care at all about your body and still be healthy. Obviously, that's not true. But I at least understand their perspective in that they're always told, you're lazy, you have to eat bland food, you're just not disciplined enough, or there's nothing you could do about it. So yeah, I mean, if I was being told that and I was someone that was struggling with my weight my whole life, I probably would say, you know what? Screw you. I am healthy. I am fine the way I am, because I don't want to listen to you because you're kind of an asshole. Then you have the issue of studies. Obviously, we talk about scientific literature all the time here at A&O, but I think that it gets a little bit misguided when you're talking about weight loss, simply because the human studies where you actually take people and you try to get them to lose weight, those studies are inherently limited by a number of different factors. The first off is that normally if you're doing this kind of study, it's called a randomized controlled trial. So you're only trying to change one variable so that you can see, does this affect everything? And then you keep everything else the same. It's a good experiment to see, causality of certain effects. But in terms of a real life application, I mean, no one's just going to do one thing if they want to lose weight, or at least they shouldn't. You should be trying to take a comprehensive overview, understand where you are at biologically, the other health problems that you have, and then try to address everything about the system in a holistic manner. No one's going to just try one supplement and think that they're going to lose a bunch of weight. At least I hope not. Then there's the issue of the whole point of randomized control trials often is so that a company can test their product and then it gets FDA approved based on that testing that was done in humans. Most of the time, it's not about, we're going to do 10 interventions and show that this method of healing someone works in real life. No. I mean, hopefully someday we can run studies like that. But at least for now, that's not really how it's structured. These studies take so much money and so much manpower and so much resources that it's almost a little silly to expect these studies to be anything but just change one thing for a couple weeks that is funded by basically a pharmaceutical company that is planning on making money off of that investment. That's really what it comes down to. Then you also have the variable of time. So, I mean, again, let's take my case, and there are obviously others, but I'm just going to use mine for now. There was a point in time about 2 years ago when I started to heal a lot of my health issues. And during that time, I actually gained probably like 30 pounds of weight, and it wasn't all muscle, I can tell you that. But the thing is that my health started to improve. My sleep started to get better. My GI function started to improve. I was just overall happier. I was more relaxed. I was more fulfilled in my life. And, I kept on that extra weight for probably a year and a half. And only after this healing process that I've started to focus on a lot of the things that I'm going to get to in a second, was I able to actually lose the weight in a way that was not just stressing my body out and just forcefully restricting things. Because I unfortunately learned the hard way that if you do that, if you just starve yourself, it's going to come back and bite you. Maybe not in terms of the weight gain, probably in terms of the weight gain, but more so just in your overall quality of life and your health. It is not worth heavily restricting your diet and going against your body's intuition just to maintain a lean physique, something that looks aesthetically pleasant. And any bodybuilder that has gotten down to single-digit body fat percentage will tell you the same thing. It is not worth it. I don't care how good I look. I feel like garbage. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but it illustrates the point. I went through this whole process of gaining weight, and then now I'm losing it, and I'm probably going to need another couple months until I get back down to the weight that I originally was, when I was at my leanest. That is a multiple month, multiple year number of different interventions. I mean, I can't even count the amount of things that I have changed in my life since then, probably well over 100, and it's taken around 2 years. So that is what I consider to be a successful weight loss journey, something that was holistic in not only losing the weight, but actually healing all of my problems in the process, and then the weight coming off as a result of that. So that's really what we should be aiming for, because so many people are sick and still lean. So you can't just starve a sick fat person and then expect them to not be sick after. They're still the same sick person. They're just in a thinner person's body. It's kind of similar to how a lot of these drugs work. It's like, if you take someone who is sick or who's depressed or who has schizophrenia or any of these other types of chronic conditions, yeah, you can just give them a drug and it might alleviate some of the symptoms, but you're not really solving anything. You're really just taking a person who is sick and then masking their sickness by force. That's really what you're doing. You're not healing the person. And we should be aiming to heal ourselves and get back to a good place of health so that we can be lean and happy and satisfied with the food that we're eating. You can have all of it at once, I promise, and I'm going to explain why. I would also like to say that me saying all this does not equate to me saying, oh, caloric restriction doesn't work or cutting your calories doesn't work. Oh, it definitely works for a period of time, or it can work indefinitely. I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but I am trying to create a sort of new paradigm around this where it's not about, oh, well, I need to restrict my calories so I can lose weight. It's about, why am I overweight to begin with? Why do I have extra fat on my body? What biological processes are driving this? What have I done in the past that might have gotten me there? And what can I do in the future to get my body in a better overall metabolic state that will lead to better body composition down the line? Then we also have the issue of exercise. The other narrative around things is that, oh, well, it's obviously eat less and move more. Well, we already talked about the eat less part of that, but the move more part is actually total crap as well. Because we do know, just like with, overfeeding and underfeeding people, over-exercising people does result in the body rebounding and compensating for that loss. So I'll give you an example. You are absolutely going crazy on the cardio. You're burning 500 calories whatever, on the elliptical, every single day you're doing that. Well, guess what? Those 500 calories are just going to come out of somewhere else. So that means that when you come home, you're probably just going to want to lay on the couch and literally not think or do about anything, because your body now has 500 fewer calories to work with, because it's not actually addressing the problem again. Your body is at a set, basically total metabolic rate, and then by forcefully exercising, you're essentially just tapping in to what your body is allowing you to expend at that point. But that has to come from somewhere. Your body isn't just going to produce more energy because of that. And I want to give a shout out to Professor John Speakman. He's done a lot of excellent work on this. He's really, I think, at the forefront of obesity research, because he's looking for the real answers. He is totally over this whole eat less, move more sort of paradigm. So big shout out to him. He's doing some excellent work, him and his lab. And he has demonstrated a few key things, and his name is going to come up later, I'm sure. But basically, he has demonstrated that the total metabolic rate, the basal metabolic rate of the United States of America, has declined over the past few decades. He's also demonstrated exactly what I've been talking about, which is, okay, let's forget about losing weight. Let's look at people who are naturally lean, people who don't have to think about being lean. And then let's take people who are the opposite, who are just naturally overweight and just can't seem to lose weight, or at least don't even try to. What is the difference between two people who aren't thinking about their diet and whatnot? What is the difference between those two people? What makes one person lean and the other person overweight? And he did find that while the lean people ate a little bit less, it wasn't enough to explain the entire effect. What was enough to explain the entire effect was the fact that the lean people naturally had much higher basal metabolic rates. And this was characterized most importantly by elevated levels of T3, the active thyroid hormone. And the thyroid hormones really they're probably your primary governor of your systemic metabolism. Although obviously it's not going to be as simple as, oh, I just need to take thyroid for every single case. But that was on average what his studies demonstrated. And I think that is a beautiful way of summing the whole thing up. I mean, you can just look at something like the Biggest Loser contest, where they took these people who were like morbidly obese, and then they basically did whatever David Goggins does, or one of these other guys who just walks around shirtless and yells at you that you're fat and that you're a fuck up. And basically they did that to these obese people, and yeah, they would lose weight. It was a successful show. That was the whole point. But what happened after the show? Well, literally all of them not only regained the weight, but they all got fatter than they even originally were. They would have just been better off not even going to the Biggest Loser, because their bodies were so hypometabolic and they were put in this extremely stressful situation, and then their bodies just further turned down their metabolic rates. Okay, so now that I got that out of the way, let's get into some of the mechanisms. The one thing that you'll often hear is that you want to basically increase the amount of fat that you're burning. So essentially there are two main processes that you should at least know the terminology about for this video. The first one is something called lipolysis, and lipolysis is basically when the fat from your fat tissue, your adipose tissue, gets secreted into the blood so that other tissues can burn it, or the liver can reprocess it. And then the process of burning the fat, a single cell taking the fat that was dumped into the bloodstream from the adipose, the activity of a cell taking that fat and then oxidizing it to produce energy, that is called beta oxidation or fat burning. So most people think, well, I need to lose fat. Don't I need to get really good at burning it? Well, no, actually, you're already way too good at burning it. What you're not good at is burning sugar. I know it sounds crazy, but what you're not good at is burning carbohydrate. I mean, this is the case in any disease that you can think of. What becomes impaired is carbohydrate metabolism. That is ultimately what characterizes and drives many of these diseases, including, most of all, insulin resistance and obesity. So no, you don't need to dump more fat into the bloodstream through lipolysis, and you definitely don't need to be burning more fat. In fact, you are already probably burning so much fat that it is creating your problems, as weird as that sounds. That is really characteristic of stress, aging, and disease. All of these states are characterized by high levels of free fatty acids in the blood and increased fat burning relative to glucose burning. More specifically, I mean the efficient burning of glucose, not just the intake of glucose into different tissues, but the actual full breakdown of glucose that produces carbon dioxide and water. People who are sick are terrible at doing that. What they have is tons of fat in their blood and tons of fat oxidation in their cells. Can you, fast and do low carb and restricted calories and get really good at fat burning and lose a bunch of fat? Yeah, you can. But again, you didn't fix the problem. And ironically, the reason that you are so bad at burning sugar is actually because of the fat that is in your blood and the fat that your cells are burning. So this is something known as the Randle cycle, and I don't need to get into all like the actual mechanisms, but basically cells pick between burning sugar and burning fat. And if there's lots of fat around, it inhibits the oxidation of sugar, of glucose, of carbohydrates. And again, from everything that we can tell, and please let me know if there are outliers. I would love to know about them. But everything that I've ever read in the metabolic research world indicates that young, healthy, and lean people are really good at burning sugar and they don't burn a lot of fat, or at least they don't burn more fat relative to sugar than someone who is sick. And in fact, you could literally define your health as how good you are at burning sugar and how much you do it. Because at the end of the day, that is what governs all of your hormonal homeostatic processes. You need the glucose. Your cells need to be good at taking it up and doing what they need to do with it. That is ultimately what governs everything about your body. So obviously, if you are not good at that process, then yeah, you're gonna have tons of health problems, and obesity or gaining extra weight is definitely one of them. In the simplest terms, the best way I can describe this is that if you're not good at burning sugar, if you're not good at producing energy from glucose, then obviously your body is going to have a propensity to store fat because that's the only thing that you can burn. So obviously your body is going to try to hold on to more of it. On the flip side, if you're really good at burning sugar and you're constantly providing that fuel to your body has no reason to hoard extra fat tissue because while you do need some fat no matter who you are, if you are good at oxidizing sugar and you do it often, then your body is not getting this signal, hey, we're not good at burning sugar, or we're not burning sugar, we don't have sugar around, so we're gonna start storing fat. It's the opposite. You should naturally lean out at that point. And then on the flip side, if you are really good at burning fat, then obviously your body is going to keep more of it around, right? There's no reason why you would stay naturally lean all the time if you've taught your body over years to be a fat burner. It likes fat now. It wants to keep more fat around. And the great irony in all of this is that because fat oxidation blocks the proper oxidation of sugar, then that really means that people who are obese, like these poor people who did the Biggest Loser contest, they are carrying around so much energy, but on a cellular functional level, their cells are actually starved. Because at the end of the day, think about nature. When are carbohydrates available? If you think about like potatoes or fruit or honey, these things are available basically like in the summer when things are good. And then on the flip side, you're probably relying mainly on your stored body fat and on other sources of fat like animals much more often in the winter. And, your body knows this. It knows to slow down the metabolic rate during the winter time when things are scarce and to put on more fat. This is a protective mechanism that the body has evolved over time. But if you're burning sugar all the time, then the body has no reason to go into that because it's getting the signal, oh, things are good. We have plenty of food. The fruit is ripe. The plants are growing. We're living good. And apparently this is also the case in hibernating animals. Essentially, I think like bears will start burning tons and tons of fat when they're hibernating, but then when they wake up, they start eating a bunch of fruit and honey, like Winnie the Pooh, basically. And they immediately go out of their insulin resistant state and then they just carry on normally because they're giving the body that signal, hey, things are fine again. It's summertime, it's spring. We can go out. We need to keep storing fat and slowing down the metabolism. Another interesting point is that insulin resistance itself, which if you don't know, insulin resistance is basically the precursor and the driver of diabetes, obviously, which goes hand in hand with obesity. Insulin resistance is actually driven by the swelling of fat cells, not the total amount of fat, but basically the inability of the fat cells to hold onto fat. Basically, the fat cells reach sort of like a critical mass. So if you swell them up enough with enough fat, then they basically start leaking more fatty acids into the blood. And then, your body starts burning those, and then it can't burn sugar. Now you have high blood sugar. Now you're diabetic, which is very interesting because there is a class of drugs, and I'm totally going to botch the pronunciation, thiazolidinediones. These compounds actually reverse insulin resistance, or at least, can treat it to a great degree. They can restore the oxidation of sugar, but they do that by actually making you fatter. So they take all of the free fatty acids from the blood. They allow your fat cells to get larger so that they can store more fat. But now that all that fat is where it's supposed to be and not in the blood, now you can burn sugar again. So the most common side effect is actually weight gain. So most people don't want to take it because they're like, dude, I don't want to be diabetic and fat when my only other option is being not diabetic and even fatter. But it's just an interesting mechanism to show how this stuff works. However, it is important to know that there are ways that the body gets rid of fat without you, just going keto or starving yourself or whatever the case may be. The heart and the skeletal muscles are pretty much always burning fat unless, you're putting them under strenuous exercise, in which case they will use sugar for short periods of time. But at rest, the heart and the muscle burn mostly fat. So it's not to say that you want to burn literally zero fat. It's to say that you don't want to make an effort to base your entire body's metabolism around burning fat. Your muscles, your heart, and your liver already deal with any fat that is going to be in the blood because there is always some. You're never going to get zero fat in the blood, and that would be a very bad thing because your heart would stop. And in fact, people who are obese are actually bad at burning fat in their muscles and in their hearts, but seem to burn it and store it and let it run loose everywhere else. Whereas lean people who, lift weights and exercise and stuff, they're extremely good at burning fat in the tissues where it's supposed to be burned, so the heart and the muscles, but they're burning sugar everywhere else at rest. That is what you should be aiming for. One more thing, you also might just be holding on to a lot of water. I think people underestimate how much water they may be holding on to, especially if your body temperature is very low and you don't sweat a lot or you're not evaporating a lot of heat. You could be holding on to multiple pounds of water. And I think that is mainly driven by estrogen. Progesterone is your body's primary anti-mineralocorticoid substance. Basically, it's your body's main diuretic. It makes you rid water, while estrogen does the opposite. You can get some progesterone over at our buddies at Health Natura. I'll put the link right here. But the point is that holding on to water, again, is a hormonal and metabolically driven process. It's all governed by hormones. You could have very poor circulation. That's because you're in the sort of starvation metabolism and your blood is being constricted to the central organs. It's not getting out elsewhere, and you're not evaporating out this water. You're just holding on to it. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about why this current narrative exists. And look, you can call me a conspiracy theorist if you want, but I don't think that it is a coincidence that these narratives about obesity and gaining weight really exist. I think that's because they understand that they have poisoned the food, that they have poisoned the water, that the environment is full of endocrine disruptors that can directly make you gain weight, that they've been telling you the wrong information about diet for multiple decades at this point. They also have us basically locked up like rats in cages in our jobs, contributing to stress, which, as we'll discuss, directly leads to the gaining of weight. They also give you tons of pharmaceuticals, which impair multiple systems in the body, can also drive weight gain. And essentially, the modern environment as a whole basically, if you do nothing and you are just a normal person walking around, not really thinking about this stuff, yeah, you probably will get fat at some point because you are being assaulted from all angles. And instead of taking responsibility and trying to clean things up and trying to make things right, it seems like they'd rather just say, oh no, you're just eating too much. Like it's your fault. Like it's not our fault. Okay, so now we're going to get into my paradigm, basically the causes and the fixes. In order to understand how to lose weight, you need to understand why you are in the position that you are to begin with. The thing that I want you to internalize with all of this is that all of these processes that I'm about to describe are self-promoting, meaning that once things start to go downhill, your body basically has a precipitous momentum drop into a state of basically hibernation type metabolism and fat gain. Again, because this is in nature really a protective mechanism, the gaining of extra weight, it's a protective mechanism to get you to survive through tough times. Once your body gets that signal, it's going to start going all out, and it's going to try to everything in its power to get you and maintain you into that state until you pull it out. So we're going to get into how. First off, let's talk about inflammation. So this is a great example of something that's basically a self-promoting mechanism. We know that obesity drives inflammation, but we also know that inflammation drives insulin resistance and drives obesity. Some of the main mechanisms by which this happen are a couple things. So the first is endotoxin. So endotoxin is essentially like a piece of a bacteria that exists normally in your colon at very low levels if you're healthy. However, if you basically have chronic gut problems and you have excess bacteria basically festering inside of you because your metabolic rate is slow or because you've been eating bad foods or whatever the case may be, for whatever reason, if you have a lot of bacteria growing in your intestines, that endotoxin that is a part of those bacteria are one of, if not the primary drivers of systemic and chronic inflammation. And ironically, in animal models, you can actually see that animals who don't have any bacteria in their gut or get their guts basically depleted of bacteria with antibiotics, these animals become extremely resistant to weight gain. Their metabolic rates basically just keep churning up no matter how much they eat. And again, I think that is because if you have a lot of bacteria, your immune system is suppressed. What does that sound like? Well, it sounds a lot like winter to me. It sounds like you're cold, you're going to get a cold, you're more susceptible to the environment. Maybe you're not getting as much vitamin D, which is very important for the immune system. Maybe you're not eating as much, which obviously you need enough food to fuel the immune system. So yeah, the bacteria basically have more of a chance to grow inside of you, and then they basically take over and initiate one of the central processes in gaining weight and slowing the metabolism. It makes perfect sense. Another thing that drives inflammation is actually the free fatty acids themselves. So this is mainly through two pathways. The first one is that if you just have tons and tons of fat in the blood, when it's exposed to cells, if it's not being actively burned, which obviously most of the time it will be, but just the mere presence of extra fatty acids in the cells can trigger cellular death and something known as lipotoxicity. Basically, you can think about it as like a cell basically just being suffocated with fat and then not being able to function and probably dying. And then the other thing is that these fatty acids in today's world are mostly of the polyunsaturated variety. Now, we've done so many videos on polyunsaturated fats in the form of vegetable oils, it's not even funny. Shout out to my guy, Dr. Mercola, for featuring us on his website. Really appreciate that. But anyway, the point is that these fats, if you're reasonably healthy and you basically have things under control, they're stored in your adipose tissue and they're not really doing anything bad in there. I mean, they can cause damage in the actual fat cells, but it's a much worse case when these polyunsaturated fats are basically flooding the blood and flooding all of your organ systems. Then they have a chance to get converted into inflammatory mediators. In fact, all of the anti-inflammatory medications that exist on the market work literally by blocking the conversion of the polyunsaturated fats into inflammatory mediators. Things like aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol. And then you also have the non-enzymatic conversion of these fats, because they're so fragile in their structure, they basically can break down inside of cells or not even in cells. And that breakdown product of that fat is essentially toxic to any type of cell. So obviously that is going to drive quite a bit of inflammation as well. The problem is that so many people have been eating so much vegetable oil and polyunsaturated fats. Really, they might not even realize it or know about it, but they've been eating these fats basically their whole lives. So their tissues have so much polyunsaturated fat that if you stress someone out and you start starving them and you just dump all of that polyunsaturated fat into the blood, that person is going to probably be in for a very rough ride. They might feel good at first because maybe they're starting to get some adrenaline or they're starting to feel good about losing weight. But that is really not what you want to do, especially in the long run, because having these free fatty acids elevated, especially the polyunsaturated variety, is basically going to tax every single cell in your body instead of just keeping it localized to the adipose tissue. We also have something called adipokines or adipokines. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but basically these are immune cells that infiltrate the fat tissue and then secrete more inflammation, basically in response to there being more fat. And again, I think that this is one of those self-promoting things where the body finds out that it's fat and then it starts initiating inflammation to further slow down the metabolic rate and keep things under control, but also keeping you very fat and basically low metabolism in the process. Another key driver of inflammation is lactic acid, and this has recently gotten some more attention. Basically, lactic acid is produced when you don't properly burn sugar. So normally when you burn sugar, under ideal circumstances, if you're doing it properly and you're healthy, your end products are ATP, which is energy, water, and carbon dioxide that's produced. However, if you're not healthy or you're not good at burning sugar or you're under stress or whatever the case may be, and you have lots of free fatty acids in your blood, those free fatty acids, basically when they're burned, they inhibit the full oxidation of glucose and they produce lactic acid. So basically you have this situation where the free fatty acids are flooding the bloodstream either because you're under stress, you're starved, David Goggins is yelling at you, or you are already obese and you have lots of free fatty acids in the blood. And then that is further preventing your ability to oxidize sugar properly. And that prevention results in lactic acid. And what does lactic acid do? Well, it initiates more inflammation and it in fact inhibits your oxidation of glucose. So you can start to see how all of these things are self-promoting. So it's really not as simple as just cutting the calories. You need to address these issues. And again, this is seen in people with diabetes and who are obese. Not only are they not good at burning sugar, they have high sugar in the blood, but they also have very high lactic acid in addition to the very high free fatty acids, which, by the way, the free fatty acids being elevated in people who are obese, that happens way before you start to see elevated blood sugar and diabetes. The elevated free fatty acids is really the main culprit behind this, ironically, which is what every single health influencer, doctor, and media corporation is telling you to do, which is start burning more fat. Here's how to burn fat. Stress yourself out. Exercise. Restrict yourself. That is literally putting you in a diabetic physiology. And in fact, a cancer physiology, because the conversion of glucose into lactate instead of into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, that is literally known as the Warburg effect. And Otto Warburg won the Nobel Prize for recognizing that this was the cause and the effect of cancer, that anything that promoted the conversion of glucose into lactic acid for long enough could cause cancer. He won the Nobel Prize for that. And it's like people just forgot about that. So for reducing lactic acid specifically, I think the biggest thing is going to be vitamin B1. And I think you really want to go for one of the fat-soluble B1 analogs, so something like prosyltiamine or benfotiamine or olitiamine. These not only get better absorbed into the blood from the gut, but they also are more closely related to the actual enzyme cofactor that is necessary for it to do its good. So basically, vitamin B1, instead of diverting glucose into lactic acid in order to burn it properly to get CO2 and water and ATP, B1 is absolutely critical for that conversion away from lactic acid. And in fact, in the hospitals, a lot of the time what they will do if someone has lactic acidosis, which is extremely dangerous and often life-threatening, if someone has lactic acidosis, something that they can do is just give IV thiamine because it lowers the lactic acid. So again, in terms of serotonin, I would definitely go check out the content that I've already released on that. It's very comprehensive, and it not only explains serotonin's role in the gut, but it also explains its role in terms of body composition and putting on more fat and reducing the metabolism. In terms of limiting the amount of free fatty acids, the free fatty acids are always released in response to stress. I mean, obviously, why would they not be? That's the whole point, is that when you are in a stressful condition and you need more energy, you dig up your fat and you start using it. But obviously, lowering stress generally is going to be huge. One of my absolute favorite supplements for this, you guys know, is pregnenolone from Health Natura. Again, best pregnenolone on the market. I don't really even think it's close. Did an entire video on how pregnenolone works, but in short, it really lowers inflammation and lowers systemic stress, but definitely check out the pregnenolone video. That's going to be huge for not only just your general well-being, but also it should have a reduction in cortisol and some of these other stress hormones. Some other things for lowering the free fatty acids directly. A big one is aspirin, also a great product at Health Natura that offers pure aspirin powder. And then vitamin B3 or niacinamide, because the downstream conversion of niacinamide results in basically something called NAD, and I don't need to get into all this, but the downstream conversion of vitamin B3 into its active form, the balance of that in the cell essentially is incredibly important for governing general energy metabolism, but especially in the fat cell, and you need more B3 so that the fat can basically hold on to more fat and it's not just mindlessly spewing it into the blood. And of course for this, so I talked a bit about exercise and how it's kind of a scam when it comes to losing weight, but that's only partially true. I think you do want to have, ideally large muscles that can eat up a lot of fat while you're at rest. And also having a healthy heart is, a no-brainer, like just overall health, you want that. But the good functioning of the heart is also important for metabolizing a lot of the fat in the process. So I'm a huge fan of resistance training. I love weight training. Recently been doing Mike Menser inspired type high intensity training. And I'm probably going to do a video about that at some point. So stay tuned for that. But basically, if you're new to lifting, you really don't need much in order to start putting on muscle and really start putting the metabolism in a better place by having more muscle mass and being able to take care of the excess free fatty acids. So another huge thing to kind of tie it into the gut sort of bacteria thing is serotonin. And again, I've talked way too much about serotonin at this point, but it just keeps rearing its ugly head, unfortunately. Serotonin is mainly produced in the GI tract in situations where there's bacterial overgrowth, where there's inflammation, where there's irritation. Basically, anytime something bad is going on in your gut, you can bet that serotonin is going to be elevated and it's going to exert its systemic effects. One of those systemic effects is drastically lowering the body temperature and the total metabolic rate. It makes you start producing more lactic acid. This has been shown. If you take animals and you basically delete their ability to produce serotonin in the gut, they have the same thing as the antibiotic depleted mice or the bacteria free mice. They don't gain any weight either. They're totally fine because serotonin peripherally, really in general, but especially in the gut and peripherally, is such a dramatic break on the metabolism. And one of the most ironic things is that serotonin is very well known to play a huge role in hibernation. There's one paper, and I'm sure there are others, but basically talking about pharmacological induction of hibernation in animals. How should we do it? Well, you better make sure to give them enough serotonin because otherwise they're not going to go into hibernation. Their body temperature isn't going to drop enough and they're going to stay awake because serotonin is so potent at slowing down the metabolism. In fact, it's actually really sad. Some of the antipsychotics nowadays, they call them, are literally just inducing hibernation in people. They say, oh, well, you're insane, so we're going to do what's called therapeutic torpor or therapeutic hibernation of your brain by giving you a drug that increases serotonin. It's going to totally tank the temperature of your brain. It's basically going to remove any higher cognitive function that makes you a human being. But hey, at least you're not hallucinating, at least you're not insane. Another interesting point is that if you are in a high serotonin state, you do go into that, hibernation type of feeling. And if you've ever slept at night and then woke up the next day and you didn't feel rejuvenated at all, it almost didn't even feel like you slept. It felt like you just went unconscious for a couple hours. That is the high serotonin state. If you're getting a very deep restorative sleep where, you're getting dreams and it feels long and you wake up, you're refreshed, that is driven by melatonin, which is a metabolite of serotonin. And of course, what do you need to convert serotonin into melatonin? What else but proper energy production? You need good mitochondrial function in order to take serotonin and convert it into melatonin. You also need good energy production in order to break down serotonin, because you need all sorts of vitamins and you need enough oxygen delivery in order to oxidize the serotonin, which essentially is like burning it. You break it down and then you excrete it, and it's fine. And again, I think that this is one of those self-enforcing things, because I've talked a bit about dopamine. I'll put the video here, but basically dopamine and serotonin are always opposing each other. And dopamine is the quintessential sign of abundance. You're happy, you're feeling pleasure, you want to do things, you want to go out, you want to move, you want to talk to people. That is the state of abundance that is associated with good metabolism. Yet dopamine opposes serotonin in the brain and vice versa. When serotonin in the brain starts to become high, dopamine starts to become low. And I'm talking under, normal conditions. Obviously there are drugs that can raise both and whatever. But my point is that, they always are inhibiting each other. And serotonin is this hibernation, metabolic slowing signal of scarcity, while dopamine is the very opposite. So in terms of endotoxin and serotonin, I've written extensively about measures that you can take for those things, but just very briefly, the main driver is going to be gut irritation and excess bacteria. The excess bacteria should be handled by having regular, healthy, well-formed, satisfying bowel movements every single day. That is going to be huge for anybody doing this. And you should actually feel like after you have a day where you have very good bowel movements, you should start to feel your body temperature increase. You should start to feel evaporation off of you. And that's because serotonin is one of these vasoconstrictors and one of these body temperature reducers. But once you eliminate a lot of the bacteria and the irritation, you should get a drastic reduction in your overall serotonin. You should start to feel a lot better. So that's obviously huge. And I'm not going to get into all the details here, but basically reducing the bacterial count. I'm not saying that everyone needs to go on penicillin or whatever. In some cases you might, but there are other measures for reducing the bacteria. One of which is our guys over at Greco Gum. And I'm going to post the link to the supplement here, but it's been a huge savior for me. And not only promoting gut motility, which gets you more movements, which gets you less serotonin, but it also is directly antibacterial. So Greco Gum is a fantastic product that I personally endorse because it's helped me out so much in my overall health, but also in a weird way in my hair loss, even though it's literally in my weight loss. Some other things that can lower the production of serotonin, especially in the gut, are the fat-soluble vitamins, because these are directly antibacterial. And vitamin D is a inhibitor of serotonin synthesis in the gut. For fat-soluble vitamins, you guys want to go to Health Natura. Excellent mom-and-pop company that I can't speak highly about enough. Their purity, their quality. You're not going to get better fat-soluble vitamins than these on the market. So definitely check out the link in the description. And I've covered all of that stuff about gut irritation, inflammation, serotonin, and its role in hibernation and gut problems. I've covered that extensively both on Twitter, and I've posted articles about it on Medium and Substack, and I'll link those in the description. We talked a little bit about gut function, but also liver function, which is ironically, in a weird way, it's a part of the GI tract. But your gut and your liver need to be working well, not just because of serotonin, although that's an absolutely huge factor, but also because of estrogen and the endotoxin or the bacteria themselves. Basically, your gut needs to be working well because if you're not having regular, complete bowel movements and you're not eliminating the bacteria over time, then obviously it's going to lead to all the problems I just described. However, you also excrete estrogen through your stool and through your urine. And that process only can happen if your gut is functioning properly, so you can actually, poop it out, and your liver is functioning properly, because what your liver does is it takes in estrogen and it takes in endotoxin and it basically detoxifies it, and then it sends it either out into the blood so that you could pee it out, or back into the colon so that you can, defecate it out. But of course, these things are also directly toxic to the liver in excess. I mean, you can look at something like hormonal birth control, which is very estrogenic. I mean, these poor women are getting liver cancers and liver damage like nothing I've ever seen before. And then, of course, endotoxin is literally one of the main ways to induce liver damage in the lab. I mean, it's pretty well known in the field that if you administer endotoxin, that is going to basically destroy their liver. And I don't think that something like, hepatitis or cirrhosis or, God forbid, liver cancer can even really happen without a sufficient load of endotoxin. So again, you're in a situation where the liver isn't functioning properly, but it needs to function properly so you can get these things in line. What's another one of the biggest poisons to the gut and to the liver? Oh, it's the free fatty acids. It's the polyunsaturated fats. It's the inflammation that is a result of all this. You can see how everything starts to fit together now. And now you're probably wondering, what the hell was everyone talking about calories for this whole time? Of course, in this case, if the liver's impaired, the gut's impaired from too much estrogen, too much endotoxin, too much bacteria, too much serotonin, well, you need to do something in order for the liver to start functioning properly again. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse, because you need those organs in order to detoxify those things. In terms of the liver, I think the biggest levers to pull for the liver, obviously the gut is very intertwined with the liver. So everything that I say about the gut, especially serotonin, is extremely important to the liver functioning well. Also, reducing the free fatty acids and the PUFA, the polyunsaturated fats in the diet and in the blood, is going to be huge in terms of protecting the liver, because those are the primary poisons of the liver. Something great to help prevent that process is vitamin E. Vitamin E, I also forgot to mention, inhibits the conversion of the polyunsaturated fats into the inflammatory mediators. Vitamin E also inhibits lipolysis. Vitamin E also functionally antagonizes estrogen. And finally, vitamin E also is very protective for the liver. So if you want to get a good whole vitamin E, so all of the analogs of vitamin E like it should be in its natural form, you don't want to just get alpha tocopherol like most of the synthetics out there. You want to get all of the tocopherol. That is the pure, correct version in which to get vitamin E. Again, Health Natura has the best product on the market. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. Just click the link if you want that. Health Natura also has vitamin D. This is pretty self-explanatory. Best product on the market. Very useful. We get it. Another interesting point, I mentioned vitamin D a little bit earlier, but vitamin D deficiency is actually known to induce obesity. Whereas, if you're overweight or you're storing fat, the vitamin D, because it is a fat-soluble vitamin, actually gets sequestered into your fat. And again, I think this is one of those things where, your body senses that maybe it's winter or you're going into hibernation, and you're basically hoarding all of the fat-soluble vitamins, especially the vitamin D, that you're not going to get for many months. It gets stored in the adipose tissue, and it doesn't release it into the blood where it can do its good. And one of those things is to raise your metabolic rate, to bolster your immune system, to protect against excess estrogen, to inhibit the synthesis of serotonin in the gut. But if you're overweight and obese, all of that vitamin D is going right to your fat. It's staying there. You're going to have a slow metabolic rate, and the circus continues. So I talked a little bit about the polyunsaturated fats before, and they keep coming up here and there. And honestly, this is a big enough topic where I want to have my buddy Brad Marshall on from Fire in a Bottle to really dive deep into this topic of how polyunsaturated fats drive the hibernation and torpor metabolism, and ultimately do result in obesity and a slowed metabolic rate. So I'm probably going to leave most of that for that podcast, so make sure you stay tuned. In the meantime, you should definitely go check out Brad. He's got a lot of incredible content. It's pretty scientifically dense, But if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. You're thinking, okay, well, dude, I have to eat something, right? Yes, you do. Let's look at in animal studies and in human populations where they are naturally lean and they don't have to think about it. In the animal studies, it is pretty clear that a diet that induces obesity, the high-fat diet, the one that is routinely used to literally study obesity, fatty liver, all of these different things, diabetes, what they feed the animals in order to study those conditions, it is so reliable at producing these conditions that it is literally sold by a company for people who want to induce these conditions. That diet is a mixed diet that has a lot of fat and a lot of carbs, but the key is that the fat needs to be mostly polyunsaturated fat. If you give animals a high-fat diet, but it's low in polyunsaturated fat, it does not matter. It does not result in all of these problems. That is the key thing. But the other thing is that if you are only eating fat for your energy, so basically you're on a low-carb diet, then the amount of polyunsaturated fat doesn't seem to matter as much. You won't get as obese, but it is very clear that the diet that leads to the most health and the most leanness in these animals, again, that is used and sold to create healthy animals, to compare the unhealthy ones that I just talked about, that diet is very high in carbs, it's pretty low in fat, and it's pretty high in protein, relatively high in protein, at least to what most people eat, not to, what I eat or anything. And what is especially important about that diet is that even that control diet over time will start to lead to some problems. It's not foolproof. The way to make it foolproof, are you ready for this, is to take out the starch that you're feeding the animals for the carbs and replace it with sugar, with table sugar. That is the diet that leads to the highest metabolic rate, that leads to the most leanness, that makes their liver function perfectly. That is the diet that you feed the animals who you want to be lean forever. The other diet, that'll keep you lean for, a couple months before the experiment starts and then the animals inevitably die. But if you want to keep an animal around for multiple years and keep it lean and healthy and high metabolic rate, you feed it a very high carb, high sugar, refined pure white sugar diet that is also low in fat, low in polyunsaturated fat by extension, and moderate in protein. That is the known diet. Again, this is not my opinion. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is literally what is administered in research settings in order to reliably induce these things. So it really doesn't get much more simple than that. So what should you take away from that? Well, I think that it's very clear that if you are trying to lose weight, the number one thing is obviously going to be reducing the polyunsaturated fats in terms of diet. But the other thing should be to replace starches with sugar, because those are the two biggest variables in this whole equation. Protein is a little bit of a different story. Obviously, protein is not going to make you fat, but I also don't think that you need to take like a bodybuilder type approach and literally just be stuffing your face with massive amounts of protein in order to lose weight. There's actually a very interesting little story, basically that pig farmers in the early 1900s would try to fatten their pigs up, and normally they did it with like sunflower oil or whatever other seeds and beans and oils and stuff like that they would give them, and that would fatten them up fine. But then at one point they tried to do it with coconut oil, and the pigs just would not get fat. They just had like super jacked, like ripped pigs. So I think that should really demonstrate the validity of this whole theory. And I should mention that yes, coconut oil seems to be the king of all fats in terms of leanness. In fact, the more saturated the fat is, you heard that right, the more saturated the fat is, the more leanness it will induce. Even a high monounsaturated fat, so you can think of it as like a 60% olive oil diet, can still lead to these problems for reasons that I'll discuss with Brad. But even that, and I don't consider olive oil to be something that you should totally not eat ever. I mean, I literally am looking at my bottle of olive oil right now. Probably will cook up a nice steak later with it. But generally speaking, the more saturated the fat is, the more lean the individual will become. And coconut oil is pretty much all saturated fat, and it can literally reverse fatty liver and it can reverse obesity just by eating more coconut oil. That's how powerful it is. So let's talk a little bit more about thyroid. So essentially what happens is that in your brain, there's the hypothalamus, and that secretes something called TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. And then that hits your pituitary, which is basically like, well, I can't point to it, but it's basically like a little bean that's at the bottom of your brain. And once the TRH hits the pituitary secretes something called TSH. And TSH is pretty much what every doctor will test for if you ask to get your thyroid numbers. And I can't tell you how many times someone will come to me and say, oh, I got my thyroid checked and it's fine. But then you find out that they were literally just testing TSH and that their number was in fact not fine. But that's another story. Essentially, the TSH then can go to the thyroid gland itself, and then the thyroid primarily releases T4 and some T3. T3 is really what you want. That's what Dr. Speakman found was correlated most significantly with natural leanness. And T3 is really what is the active thyroid hormone. That is really what boosts the metabolism of a cell. So when T4 gets secreted from the thyroid, it goes to peripheral tissues and it can get converted into either T3, which as we discussed is active and good. And then there's reverse T3. And reverse T3, again, is one of these things that is increased in fasting and starvation and basically caloric restriction. And it's a brake on the metabolism. There's this pretty funny clip of Peter Attia, and I have nothing against Peter Attia. I really don't know anything about his work, but I did think it was funny that he basically was saying, oh yeah, I was fasting and my T3 just went in the toilet and my reverse T3 just went through the roof. But I think he actually backed off of fasting for that exact reason. He said that he started to notice that he was cold and that his thyroid numbers were absolute garbage when he was fasting all the time. But that really illustrates the point. Basically, mainly the liver, but other tissues as well, can convert T4 into reverse T3, basically to halt the metabolism, to put the brake on the metabolism. And conversely, the conversion into T3 is what is associated with abundance and lots of sugar and the burning of glucose. And in fact, this is one of the things, if you see these older overfeeding studies, if you just start, shoving people's faces full of food, even if they don't want it, one of the reasons why they're able to just burn it off immediately is because they just start producing way more T3, and that boosts their metabolic rate and they just burn it right off. However, the conversion of T4 into T3 and not into reverse T3 is primarily dependent on what else but keeping your stress low, which means keeping your sugar high, your calories, in line with what you are craving, and your liver needs to be able to store glycogen, which is basically the liver's way of storing extra sugar. Your liver needs to be able to do that in order for the proper conversion of T4 into T3. Obese people, their livers are probably poisoned for all of the reasons that we've talked about, so they can't produce T3. And again, this is interesting because it basically goes to show that the starvation, restriction, stress metabolism is actually the same exact metabolism as the obese metabolism. So in a weird way, when you're fasting and when you're incredibly lean and stressed, you actually have the same basic metabolism as someone who is obese. You are basically just in a lean person's body with the same metabolism. I don't think you necessarily need to start off by directly taking natural desiccated thyroid or some other thyroid hormone. I think that there's a lot of things that can block the usage of thyroid, mainly what else but the free fatty acids. That definitely inhibits your cell's uptake of thyroid hormone, as well as estrogen. So keeping estrogen in check is going to be huge for thyroid utilization. Also, many of the B vitamins, I think if you can get a good B vitamin complex, because the B vitamins are all so crucial to the burning of glucose, I think having an excess of them is basically just allowing your cells to burn this stuff like crazy and really raise the metabolic rate. So definitely I would check that out. So that brings up another interesting topic, which is the role of stress, specifically cortisol, which is the quintessential stress hormone. And what is really interesting is a condition called Cushing's syndrome. And Cushing's syndrome is essentially characterized by producing massive quantities of cortisol. It's associated with all types of horrible outcomes in terms of your overall health, but mainly you can just look at the body composition of these individuals. They have central obesity and they have very little muscle mass. And I think one of the main reasons behind this is not only does cortisol activate pretty much all of the stress systems that we've talked about, and many of them activate cortisol itself. So it really does play a very central role in everything. Cortisol can actually upregulate the body's capability of producing fat from carbohydrate, which is normally a very minor pathway. Normally, all of the fat that is produced in your body, well, not all of it, but the vast majority of it does come from your diet, because why would your body take carbs and turn it into fat unless it was in a very stressful situation or it thought that it was time to hibernate, right? So cortisol directly upregulates your synthesis of fat from carbohydrate instead of burning the carbohydrate. What else does that? Well, inflammation does. And this is seen in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, where people have upregulated capabilities of producing fat from sugar when normally that is not the case. Normally that sugar is burned or that sugar is stored. But under cases of inflammation and high cortisol, more of the sugar gets devoted to storing fat. Again, part of this self-promoting process of basically slowing down the metabolism and putting on extra weight so that the body can protect itself. Another interesting thing is that this is also self-promoting because people who are obese have more of the enzyme that basically activates cortisol from its inactive precursor. So if you are obese, one of the reasons you may be obese is because your cortisol is high, your stress is very high. But then in response to that, your body just produces more fat. It learns to basically start producing fat from carbohydrate when it normally wouldn't. And on top of that, any of the cortisol that gets inactivated, if it reaches your fat tissue, can get reactivated more than it normally does back into cortisol that just keeps this whole thing going. And this is also an interesting point, because one of the reasons why people tend to overeat generally is because of stress. Because food is your body's primary way of knowing that things are okay, and starvation is the complete opposite of that. Once you eat, your stress hormones always decline. Of course they do. I mean, have you ever felt more wired after you ate? Or if you were really worried in things and then you sat down and ate a meal, you always feel more relaxed after, because the eating of food, generally speaking, unless your gut is in absolutely horrible shape and anything that you eat really just makes you inflamed and raises your cortisol and things. But generally speaking, people go to food as a way to relieve their stress because it makes them feel better about the anxiety or the problems that they have in their lives. So once again, you're dealing with a positive sort of feedback loop that is not going to resolve itself unless a proper stress reducing intervention, or ideally multiple interventions, are done. Another contributing factor is obesogens in the environment, and these can come in many forms, mainly these persistent organic pollutants, basically byproducts of industrial manufacturing that are fat soluble, tend to linger in the environment because they're not normally biodegraded by other animals or humans for that matter, like other natural substances are. These substances basically linger in the environment and inside of you for years, if not decades. They increase estrogen, which, as we discussed, is a player here, but they also are stored in your fat. So once again, you have something where if you are fat, then there's a problem that you are retaining a lot of those things. Or perhaps it's not a problem. Perhaps the body is actually storing fat in order to protect the rest of the body and keep those pollutants, those toxins, in a place where it's relatively safe and it's not going to cause harm to the rest of the body. Because if the liver is damaged and the gut is damaged, as it often is in individuals dealing with obesity or different health problems, then yeah, it would make sense for the body to sort of sequester those pollutants. We also have the case of insulin resistance. So there it is definitely true that if you take lots of insulin and you're diabetic, you are going to start to put on fat because insulin does promote the storage of fat. That does not equate to the eating of carbohydrate, which stimulates insulin, leading to fat. That is just definitely not true. And that's mainly because insulin needs to be elevated very high and for very long periods of time in order to have substantial impacts on the amount of fat that you store. But other than taking an insulin injection if you're diabetic, where is that chronically high level of insulin going to come from? Well, it's going to come from insulin resistance. And then why are you insulin resistant? Why are you not responding to insulin? Well, the primary objective of insulin is to take glucose, pull it into the cell so it can get burned for energy. So if you're not good at burning that sugar, you are not going to respond to insulin. You are going to have high levels of insulin. That insulin is going to create a positive feedback loop. It is going to be chronically elevated, and that's going to turn on all of the signals to start storing fat. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about androgens and essentially the balance of estrogens to androgens is mainly governed by an enzyme called aromatase. And aromatase basically takes testosterone or something like DHEA, other androgenic hormones that are normally associated with, muscle mass and, good health and lean body composition and energy and sex drive. Those can get converted into estrogens by the enzyme aromatase. And who would have guessed, but the enzyme aromatase is stimulated by a few things. It's stimulated by polyunsaturated fat metabolites, polyunsaturated fats themselves, excess body fat, and inflammation, and endotoxin, and serotonin. So it's almost poetic and beautiful how well everything fits together. And there's a reason for that, because God didn't do this intentionally. If you are in a stress state and you're in poor health, and your body is going to turn on all of the systems to make sure that you are harboring more energy and that you are conserving energy for the future. It's actually a brilliant system that is set up. Now, it's not something that you want to be in, because today there is no scarcity, really. If you live in a first world country, there really is no scarcity. And that doesn't mean that you have to self-impose it. It just means that you need to pull your body out of a state where it thinks that it's scarce because it's very stressful and there's a lot of bad things in the environment. You need to pull your body out of that state and get it thinking that, oh no, we're in a time of abundance. Things are good. We can lose the weight. Now, in terms of androgens and testosterone, you need sufficient amounts of calories. You need enough energy on hand in order to make that conversion. Otherwise, a lot of it is going to go to estrogen, or maybe not even get that far in the first place. Obviously, pregnenolone can be very useful for this, because most people's problem is in the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone. So taking pregnenolone could very likely alleviate that and lead to higher androgen levels down the line. But you also need zinc, vitamin D, I think vitamin A, and generally speaking, you need good energy production. You also need saturated fats. The polyunsaturated fats are very well known to, in humans, in the clinical studies, they do lower testosterone. And this is like kind of a meme, but it's actually true on a sort of scientific level that you do want to eat more saturated fat for more testosterone. And obviously the polyunsaturated fats, being what they are, promoting every single problem that exists in this entire video, obviously the polyunsaturated fats are not good for testosterone. In general, I guess I'm not going to be able to address every single possible, hole in your metabolic chain that is keeping you stressed or that is, inhibiting your metabolism of glucose. So if you need help navigating this, because again, this is a systemic health problem that's probably going to require months, if not years, in order to properly correct and figure out. If you need some help with that, I do offer consultations at Patreon. I'm trying to keep the prices very low. I do need to get paid out of respect for my time, and more people are joining and seem to be happy with the service. But it is very affordable. It's for the whole month. We can exchange, and it's at a pretty reasonable price in my view. And I can definitely help you out with this whole process on a more individual level. But the things that I just mentioned are kind of just off the top of my head, and the big ones that I thought of that can apply to most people. But with all of that being said, thank you for joining me on this really long and drawn out episode of Metabolic Mastery. This one took a lot out of me, but I actually had a lot of fun making it. And, you know, a lot of people were asking for something like this. So I hope that this can be useful. And again, feel free to comment and I can answer some of your questions. Feel free to email me. I can answer some of your questions. Definitely sign up for Patreon if you want some one-on-one work. I can, you know, do my best to try to help you out. And then, you know, obviously check out all our other stuff. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're getting on TikTok soon. Medium, Substack, the list goes on. Reddit, Ray Pete Forum. We are trying to be everywhere and spread this message far and wide. So make sure to come along for the ride, man. It's been so much fun, the growth that we've been achieving over the last couple months, and it's just incredibly fulfilling to hear people say that you know, they're actually getting something out of this, and maybe it's helping them. But we're just getting started. We got a long way to go, and definitely look out for the next video. It's going to be huge. So with that all being said, take care, and yeah, don't let them fool you. Subscribe.